Welcome to this course on the technology of ancient Greece and Rome. When you consider these great civilizations of classical antiquity, what's the first thought that comes to mind? If you're culturally minded, perhaps it's a particular piece of Greek sculpture, tragedy by Sophocles, or one of Plato's dialogues, perhaps Homer's Iliad or Virgil's Aeneid. If you're into politics, maybe it's Athenian democracy or the Roman Republic. If you like sports, you're probably thinking of the Olympic Games or bloody gladiatorial contests in the Roman arena. Military history buff? No doubt you're imagining a great battle like Marathon, Thermopylae, or Actium. Well, I'm an engineer, so when I think about classical antiquity, I think about technology. Monumental structures like the Parthenon and the Colosseum. Infrastructure systems like vast Roman water supply networks and surprisingly sophisticated machines like water-powered mills, construction cranes, and catapults. My overarching goal for this course is to share this latter perspective with you, to augment your appreciation for the cultural, political, and historical dimensions of classical antiquity by providing you with an opportunity to explore its technological dimension as well from an engineering perspective. When all is said and done, I hope you'll have learned to see these great civilizations in a broader, richer, and more satisfying way. To illustrate this point, let's consider one of the most pivotal events in human history, the Battle of Salamis, which occurred in September of 480 BC. Now, the narrative of this great naval confrontation between Greeks and Persians is quite familiar, particularly to those of us who've partaken of the great course's many offerings in ancient Greek history. But to briefly summarize, King Xerxes of Persia had invaded Greece with an immense multinational army and a supporting fleet of over 1,000 warships. On land, Xerxes' army crushed the Greeks' forward defense at Thermopylae Pass and then marched south to sack Athens and seize all of Attica except Salamis Island. But at Salamis, a small Greek fleet opposed the Persians at sea and won an epic victory that changed the course of world history. The warships on both sides of this battle were triremes, 125-foot-long wooden galleys, each rowed by 170 men arrayed on 3 levels. The trireme was, in essence, a human-powered torpedo. It engaged enemy vessels by ramming them with a bronze-clad ram on its prow. And engage they did. Having lured the mighty Persian armada into the narrow strait separating Salamis Island from the mainland, the Greeks won a stunning victory, despite being outnumbered 3-1. The Battle of Salamis cost the Persians some 300 ships and tens of thousands of crewmen. It dealt a death blow to the Persian invasion, and it opened the door to the extraordinary cultural achievements of classical Greece. On that fateful day in 480 BC, the philosophy of Socrates, the history of Herodotus, and the elegant buildings on the Acropolis, all were yet to come. All would emerge from a flourishing Athenian democracy over the next century and would ultimately become integral to our very definition of Western culture. In a real sense, then, the Battle of Salamis changed the world. So why did the Greeks win at Salamis? Well, certainly they employed a superior strategy, choosing to fight in the narrow channel where the Persians' advantage in numbers would be negated. Surely, the Greek cultural predisposition toward metis, or cunning, was also a factor, as the Athenian general Themistocles used a brilliant ruse to lure the Persians into the channel the night before the battle. Politics influenced the outcome as well. Most of the Persian fleet was manned by conquered peoples, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Carians, Ionian Greeks, all fighting to fulfill their obligation to Xerxes, their imperial master. The historian Herodotus tells us that the captains of the Persian fleet repeatedly made poor tactical decisions because they were preoccupied with impressing the great king. And their rank-and-file oarsmen, subjects of a despotic ruler, could hardly have rowed with the same do-or-die spirit as the Greeks, free citizens whose families and cherished homeland hung in the balance. No doubt then, strategic, cultural, and political factors contributed to the Greek victory at Salamis. But there's also an important technological dimension to this story. And I suggest that we can't fully understand the historical event without also understanding how it was influenced by technology. But how could technology have mattered at Salamis when both sides were using the same type of warship, the trireme? Well, the answer to that question is that the Greeks and Persians employed this technological system quite differently at Salamis. Consider, for example, that during the night before the battle, the entire Greek fleet had been dragged up onto the northern shore of Salamis Island, while the Persian fleet spent the night at sea, arrayed in full battle order, with crews manning their oars. Why the difference? Well, the Greeks were following standard practice for the employment of triremes, which were typically pulled onto shore every night so their wooden hulls could be dried out and protected from the teredo worm, a particularly destructive type of wood-boring mollusk native to the Mediterranean region. This practice was unique to warships. Merchant vessel hulls of this era were covered with a thin layer of lead sheeting, so they didn't have to be dragged onto shore for protection. But lead sheeting couldn't possibly have been used on a trireme, because it would have made the ship unacceptably heavy. As we'll learn in Lecture 23, the trireme was probably the most optimized mechanical system in all of antiquity. Because it was employed as a human-powered torpedo, it had to be fast and maneuverable. Thus, the hull had to be as light as possible, yet strong enough to withstand the extreme structural demands of ramming enemy ships. In a battle like Salamis, even a small edge in performance might be the difference between life and death, victory and defeat. So the practice of hauling those ships onto shore at night was really just a price that had to be paid for optimal performance. But then why did the Persian ships remain at sea for the entire night before the battle? Well, Xerxes ordered them to sail into the channel and to remain at the ready to prevent the Greeks from escaping. But this action proved to be unnecessary because the Greeks weren't trying to escape, and ill-conceived because it ignored two key technological limitations of the trireme. First, without having been dried out on shore, the Persian hulls would have been waterlogged and therefore slower than their Greek adversaries. And more importantly, the Persian oarsmen, the human engines of the trireme, would have rowed into battle without having slept for a full 24 hours prior. Now, for the sake of optimized performance, the trireme was built just barely large enough to accommodate its 170 rowers seated on their wooden benches. Packed into the hull like sardines in a can, these men couldn't possibly have slept or prepared meals at sea. It's also worth noting that a healthy adult can produce sustained power output of about 1/10 horsepower, more or less indefinitely. But a well-rested man in good physical condition can produce over 1 horsepower for short periods. Given this tenfold range in potential human power output, the Persian crew's fatigue would have resulted in a substantial degradation of their ship's performance. Furthermore, Herodotus tells us that Xerxes augmented each trireme's standard crew with 30 Persian soldiers, probably to ensure that those Phoenician, Egyptian, and Ionian oarsmen remained loyal to the great king. But these additional troops would have increased the overall weight of each ship by about 8%. And because these men could only have been stationed on its upper deck, they would have made the vessel dangerously top-heavy. This situation would have been greatly exacerbated by the fact that triremes carried no ballast, that extra weight that merchant ships of this era placed deep in their holds to enhance their resistance to capsizing, but would have been unacceptably heavy and therefore would have unacceptably impeded a trireme's performance. There can be no doubt then that the Greek victory against such incredible odds at Salamis can be attributed, at least in part, to the combined effects of the Persian ships' overloaded, unstable, waterlogged hulls and the reduced power output of tired, hungry oarsmen. These factors are all associated in some way with the unique technological characteristics of the trireme. How could we really understand what happened at Salamis without first understanding the capabilities and limitations of this fascinating engineered system? So why is ancient technology worth learning about? Well, I'll suggest 3 reasons. First, as we saw at Salamis, technology can sometimes influence the course of human events quite directly. But even when it doesn't, technology always reflects the social, political, and cultural context from which it emerged. Thus, we can appreciate an ancient civilization more deeply if we understand something about the technological developments it fostered. Second, we should know about Greek and Roman technologies because they've influenced our own modern world in so many substantive ways. Now, the modern legacy of ancient technology will be the principal focus of our final lecture in this course, so I won't go into it in detail here, but I do think you'll be amazed at the extent to which we all encounter this legacy in our daily lives. My third and most heartfelt reason for studying Greek and Roman technology is that this technology is just so darn interesting, sometimes even astonishing. This is particularly true because the design of ancient technologies was severely constrained by relatively crude materials, extremely limited sources of power, and lack of scientific models that could be used to predict the behavior of physical systems as scientific models are used in engineering today. As a result, ancient engineers had to be exceptionally clever in designing structures and mechanical devices, and these systems often display the ingenuity of their creators with great clarity. Learning to discern and appreciate this virtuosity in design is, for me, the greatest source of joy in studying ancient technology. Now, to reinforce this point, let's look at a particularly fascinating piece of ancient machinery, a Greek stone-throwing catapult called the palantone. We'll examine this machine in great detail during lecture 21, so for now I only want to whet your appetite. Developed during the 4th century BC, the palantone was the product of a developmental process that began with a conventional bow and arrow and culminated in a machine that looked just like this, but was 20 times larger. Now, the palantone is classified as a torsion catapult. And that refers to the fact that its principal source of power is these 2 torsion springs. So what's torsion? Well, the word torsion refers to the twisting, typically of a structural element. And that's indeed precisely how these springs operate. My model uses nylon rope for the torsion springs, which is actually a very poor substitute for the actual material used in the Greek palantone, animal tendons or sinew. And if the use of animal tendons to power a catapult seems odd, well, it's a fact that the Greeks couldn't have chosen a better material for the job. It turns out that the effectiveness of a spring depends on its ability to store elastic energy. And sinew has 20 times the capacity for elastic energy storage of modern structural steel. These sinew ropes were then wound into bundles, supported on this wooden and metal framework, and then wooden throwing arms were thrust into the bundles, as you can see here. A sling was then stretched between the ends of those throwing arms, and then that sling was engaged in a rather ingenious trigger device. Once the trigger was engaged, a projectile was placed behind the sling, and in an actual palantone, that projectile might very well be a stone ball weighing as much as 200 pounds. In order to cock the weapon, 2 operators would have used these handspikes inserted into the device here at the rear of the machine called a windlass. And by the way, the windlass is believed to have been invented by no less than Archimedes, that great Greek mathematician who we'll be talking about quite often during this course. The 2 operators turn the windlass by pulling their handspikes back 1/4 of turn at a time. And through the ingenious configuration of this device, they're able to provide a continuous pull by alternating the use of the 2 handspikes. Now, as I'm rotating the windlass, if you look forward on the front end of the palantone, you'll notice that as the windlass pulls back, this wooden tray called the slider, which also includes the trigger mechanism and now the sling, The rearward motion of the slider is rotating the throwing arms backward. As the throwing arms rotate backwards, they also rotate the torsion springs. And that action, the rotation of the springs, is the source of the elastic energy that will result in the power of the palantone being ultimately translated into kinetic energy, the energy of motion in this projectile. So once the device has been fully cocked, like this, notice that this ratchet mechanism on the side clicks into place and allows the slider to remain in position even though I'm no longer pulling on the windlass. The weapon's now cocked and ready to shoot. All I need to do in order to fire it is to swing it around on its support, take aim at some barbarian target off in the distance, and pull the trigger. Wait a minute. Before I shoot this thing, we really should spend some time talking about the historical development of the palantone and also discussing the engineering principles that govern its operation. So we'll return to the palantone in lecture 21. Remember, I did say I was only going to whet your appetite. Now at this point, if you're convinced that ancient technology is worth studying, we should spend a few minutes talking about how we're going to study it. The scope of this course is limited primarily to the development of large-scale engineered systems during the period of classical antiquity, though we will occasionally look at earlier technologies when they're relevant to the subject at hand. The term classical antiquity refers to Greco-Roman civilization during a 1,300-year period that spans 5 major historical eras. The Greek Archaic era, which began around 800 BC when Homer's epic poems were first being written down. The Hellenic era, also called the era of classical Greece, which began with the emergence of Athenian democracy around 500 BC and ended with the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC. The Hellenistic era, characterized by the spread of Greek influence through much of the Mediterranean world under the auspices of competing kingdoms established by Alexander's successors. The Roman Republic, which was established in 509 BC and initially coexisted with those Hellenistic kingdoms, but ultimately conquered them all. And finally, the Roman Imperial era, which is generally dated from 27 BC, when Octavian assumed the title Augustus, to 476 AD, when the last Western Roman emperor was deposed. Now, although our course spans this 1,300-year period, its organization is thematic rather than chronological. These lectures are organized into 3 major sections, each addressing a particular category of engineered system. First, we'll spend 8 lectures examining important structural and construction technologies in buildings from the earliest Greek temples to the Roman Pantheon of the 2nd century AD. We'll then devote 6 lectures to Greek and Roman infrastructure systems, roads, bridges, water supply networks, sewage systems, and public baths, as well as the urban planning methods that tied all these systems together. And then finally, we'll wrap up the course with 8 lectures on ancient machines used in construction, water lifting, power production, grain milling, and transportation. Warning, this is not a survey course. As such, we won't try to cover every possible category of ancient technology. Topics like mining, agriculture, timekeeping, hand tools, arms and armor, coinage, textiles, ceramics, glass. They're quite interesting and very important, but they're beyond the scope of this particular course on large-scale engineered systems. Warning, this is an engineering course. Thus, in each technological category, we'll be examining just a few representative examples in depth. For example, hundreds of Greek temples have survived from antiquity. Yet when we consider this topic in Lecture 4, we'll spend most of our time exploring just one building, the beautiful Temple of Concordia at Agrigento, Sicily. This is neither the largest nor the most important Doric temple ever built. but it is one of the best preserved and best documented. And so we can use the Temple of Concordia as a vehicle for learning deeply about the Greek temple as a technological entity, rather than surveying many examples more superficially. For all the engineering systems we examine, we'll seek to answer three big questions. First, how was it built? Second, how did it work as an engineered system? And third, how is it situated within the broader context of technological development in the ancient world? To answer these questions in a rigorous way, I'll be introducing some basic scientific and engineering principles throughout the course. In our lectures on structures, for example, we'll learn some basic concepts in engineering mechanics, how structural elements like beams, columns, and arches carry load. When we examine infrastructure systems, we'll learn about hydrology, hydraulics, and surveying. In our study of ancient machines, we'll apply the concepts of energy, work, power, mechanical advantage, and buoyancy. Don't panic. Even if math and science aren't your strong suit, I think you'll find the realm of ancient technology provides a compelling, rewarding, and intensely interesting context for learning some basic concepts about how our physical world works. As we explore the application of these principles in an amazing variety of technological systems, we're going to encounter some recurring themes. And I'd like to conclude today's lecture by raising your awareness of these four threads of continuity. So perhaps they'll be more meaningful to you when we encounter them later on in the course. The first of these themes took me completely by surprise when I was preparing the course. As I began my research, I fully expected to find a more or less definitive body of scholarly understandings about Greek and Roman technology. I was so wrong. In the lectures ahead, we'll encounter numerous cases where the accumulated wisdom of centuries has only recently been completely overturned as a result of new archaeological evidence, new analytical tools, or new interpretations of old evidence. I'll be doing my best to provide these recent perspectives throughout the course, but recognize that the story of ancient technological development is still being written. This course certainly won't be the final word on the subject. We'll see these sorts of scholarly paradigm shifts in several specific technological categories, like land transport, water power, and warship design. But this general phenomenon is also evident in a persistent belief throughout much of the 20th century that the classical era was actually a time of technological stagnation. This theory was based primarily on the observation that the Greco-Roman world produced very few fundamentally new inventions. And indeed, this premise is actually quite correct. Inventions that predated the Greek Archaic era include animal power, metallurgy, stone masonry, terracotta, the wheel, wedge, lever, pulley, sail, and even the arch, a technology we normally associate with ancient Rome, but is actually much older. But during the entire 1300-year span of classical antiquity, the only major new inventions were the screw, the water wheel, and concrete. But does lack of invention really constitute technological stagnation? Many current classical scholars say no. They argue, and I agree, that proponents of the technological stagnation theory have defined technological development far too narrowly as invention and nothing more. A recent, more holistic model defines technological development in terms of four phases: invention, the act of implementing an original idea in a new device; innovation, the process by which an invention is brought into use; diffusion, the process by which an innovation is communicated through a social system; and finally, technology in use, the processes of employing existing technologies, maintaining them, and adapting them to new purposes over time. And by the way, if you don't think the employment of technology is important, remember how it influenced the outcome at the Battle of Salamis. In terms of this four-phase model, it's evident that the Greeks and Romans did little inventing, but they did contribute immeasurably to technological development through innovation, diffusion, and use. For example, the Greeks didn't invent the lever, but their integration of the lever into the design of this bronze force pump was a brilliant innovation. Note how the rotation of the lever moves the two pistons in an alternating up and down cycle that ensures a continuous flow of pumped water. Subsequent diffusion of this device throughout the Mediterranean world resulted in its adaptation to an amazing variety of applications: irrigation, water supply, mining, firefighting, removing bilge water from ships, and even spraying perfume during theater performances. We'll be looking at this system in greater detail when we discuss water lifting devices in Lecture 18. And in a broader sense, we'll see innumerable examples of these sorts of creative adaptations of technology in many of our upcoming lectures. And this brings us to our second major theme, that these ancient engineers were just amazingly clever people. Unfortunately, we don't know much about them personally, but we can certainly admire their work, the best examples of which reflect great creativity in design, deep qualitative understanding of engineering principles, and a well-honed ability to translate their ideas into functioning products. Any notion that ancient engineering was primitive can be summarily dismissed in light of sophisticated systems like the Greek paleontone we just examined. Third theme: the most productive periods of classical era technological development occurred under the patronage of powerful political leaders. Now, in the modern world, we have a system of patent law so that inventors can reap direct economic benefits from their work. But in a world without patents, royal patronage was practically the only way to provide a similar incentive. Thus, as we'll see, technological development was far more robust in the kingdoms of the Hellenistic world than it had been in the democratic city-states of Hellenic Greece. And the engineering achievements of imperial Rome far exceeded those of the Roman Republic. Political patronage of science and technology is best exemplified by the famed Museum of Alexandria, established by the Ptolemaic kings of Egypt around 300 BC. And no physical remains of the Museum of Alexandria have survived to the present. But we know from ancient texts that this House of the Muses wasn't a museum in the modern sense, but rather a research center that brought together some of the Hellenistic world's finest scholars to solve practical problems. During the coming lectures, we'll meet several of these men: Ctesibius, Philo of Byzantium, Hero of Alexandria, and we'll see the important technologies they developed at this extraordinary institution. Our fourth and final theme is not an observation at all, but rather a person. His name is Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, and he's the author of De Architectura, the sole surviving treatise on architecture and engineering from the ancient world. Vitruvius was a 1st century BC Roman architectus, a job title that encompasses not just architecture, but also the modern professions of engineer, construction manager, and urban planner. Vitruvius is a dominant theme of this course because De Architectura serves as one of our principal sources for every major form of classical era technology except the Roman imperial construction methods that were developed after Vitruvius's day. Yes, we're going to be seeing a lot of this guy in the lectures ahead. Now, given his role as our principal source for this course, I'd like to close today's lecture with some thoughts from De Architectura, Chapter 1, Book 1, Vitruvius' famous discourse on the qualifications required of the architectus. He must be skillful with the pencil, Vitruvius says, so he can prepare sketches and plans. He should understand geometry, so he can rightly apply the square and the level in construction. He must know about history, because many architectural features derive from historical antecedents. About philosophy, because it will render him courteous, just, and honest. About medicine, so he can judge water quality. Law, so he can draw up construction contracts. Astronomy, so he can design sundials. And best of all, he must have an ear for music, so he can properly adjust the tension of catapult springs by plucking them and discerning the correct musical note. Well, that's quite some job description. It sounds like a typical customer of the great courses. And in the spirit of the great courses, just as Vitruvius suggests that the work of the architectus requires a learned, broadly educated person, So I suggest that studying the work of the architectus will help us become more learned, broadly educated people as well. So study we shall. Next lecture, our journey begins with an introduction to engineering materials, the substance of technology. Until then, thank you.